so keep your hand back a little bit. Thank you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Reference Point. I'm your host, Dave Cokerhook, and welcome back to a second episode conversation with David Robinson Simon, who is the author of this really amazing book called Metanomics. We've been talking about it now for the first part of the show, and we're going to continue. And so, David, thank you for sticking around for a second part of the conversation. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me.
So, I was thinking about this, and there are a couple of things that I want to cover in this next 30-minute segment, and one of which has to do with something that you talk about again in your book, and we sort of alluded to it a little bit earlier. It has to do with these kind of laws that are passed, and there was terminology that was used, Gag Laws and animal enterprise terrorism laws, and as an attorney, can you explain to us what those are all about and how that impacts this whole area of the industry?
Sure. And to explain these laws, I need to give you a little bit of background because they fit into a fabric of a massive sort of legal protection scheme that the animal agriculture industry has adopted for itself in this country. There's this organization called the American Legislative Exchange Council, or ALEC, that at the state level is responsible every year for passing typically a couple hundred laws that help industry. They are responsible for laws like Gag Laws, laws like these animal enterprise terrorism laws, and lots of others that help animal industry. An Gag Law, for example, is a law that makes it a crime to engage in undercover investigations at a factory farm. It can criminalize, these laws might criminalize lying on an employment application to gain access. They might criminalize taking video or photographs without authorization. But however they do it, the result is that they make it either illegal or very, very difficult to obtain undercover footage. Now, the interesting feature of these laws is that they are being attacked in the courts. And in two cases already, in Idaho and Utah, we've seen federal courts strike them down on First Amendment grounds. That is to say, our right of free speech in this country under the U.S. Constitution actually gives us the ability to film matters of important public interest. So some of these laws in some cases are being struck down, and I'm optimistic that more will be.
Well, that's a good sign.
That is a very good sign. It shows that at least there is some sense, at least at the judicial level.
Before you go on, I think one of the things that's important about that, it kind of goes back to something that we touched on in the first show, and I want to get into more detail in this show, and that has to do with the treatment of the animals that are farmed for our food. Because, I think we've all seen things here or there, little tidbits, maybe it's on the web or maybe it was on a TV show or something like that, where the cattle or the chickens or the pigs or whatever are not necessarily treated with kit gloves as they take them to slaughter. So the fact that there are these things that are going on and that can be more potentially exposed more, I think is helpful because it gives people an understanding of where their food comes from. So I just wanted to say that.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. And for many people, the way that animals treated in factory farms is so saddening that people have sought to no longer support the industry by going vegan or plant-based. And it's a huge motivating factor for millions of people around the world.
I saw an ad on TV last week. It was for the SPCA because there was like this thing about dogs that they had found at some location somewhere that were emaciated, they had been chained up, they had no water and blah, blah, blah. And so they're looking, we love our dogs and we'll do almost anything for our dogs, but it's like other animals are just like, okay, whatever's going to happen, happens. Okay, so about the animal enterprise terrorism laws. That's different than an ag-gag, yes?
Yep, that's different. These are laws. So there's one law at the federal level, and then there are many laws at the state levels. We have these laws in about 2/3 of the states in this country. These are laws that provide enhanced criminal penalties for what would otherwise be considered relatively innocuous crimes. So malicious mischief or vandalism. When the target is a so-called animal enterprise, that is to say, virtually any type of business that involves animals. So it could be a restaurant, a factory farm, a testing facility, a grocery store. If animals are involved, it becomes an animal enterprise. And then if an activist does something that's otherwise punishable by, say, a month in jail, he or she might find that suddenly they're subject to enhanced penalties. They might go to jail or for a year, or even go to state prison for a year.
Wow. So they're trying to deter people from speaking out.
That's right. The animal food industry is very aggressive in getting these laws passed to protect its business interests.
Okay. Thank you for explaining those to me. I appreciate that. The other things I wanted to chat about, now, we covered financial costs a lot in the first show, and that was really interesting. $414 billion in externalized costs that are being passed on, and it artificially impacting the retail cost of products, and therefore what that does for demand, et cetera. But your book talks about several other areas: health costs, environmental costs, and humane treatment costs, and we've touched a little bit on each one. But I think it's important for us to kind of dig into these a little bit more, because they are a key component of what this is all about. So what about these health costs? Your book talks about a number of reports and several other things, like the China syndrome, I think you mentioned in your book, which is one that I've read, and others that talk about the scientifically identified and documented impact of high consumption of animal foods, and the misconception that protein can only come from animals. And so what is the impact from a health perspective when it comes to its economic impact as well as sociological impact?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the health costs are the largest component by far of that $414 billion. The health costs each year in this country associated with consuming animal foods are approximately $314 billion. Now, in calculating those costs, what I did is I looked at just the portion of mainly 3 diseases: cancer, diabetes, and heart disease. The portion of the cases in this country that the clinical literature suggests is attributable to consuming animal foods. There are many reasons why somebody could get cancer. If you smoke 10 packs of cigarettes a day, you might develop lung cancer, right, even if you're vegan. So I'm excluding cancers like that. You might be genetically predisposed to diabetes. I'm excluding cases like that. I'm just looking at those incidents of those diseases that are thought to be attributable to consuming an animal food heavy diet. Those numbers are enormous. And there are some other things included in that health category, like antibiotic resistance. But that's a relatively small figure. Really, at $314 billion, almost the entirety of it is related to cancer, diabetes, and heart disease. These are the 3 of the biggest diseases affecting Americans today.
Oh, sure.
And a significant portion of the cause of these diseases is the fact that we consume animal foods at such an incredibly high level in this country.
That's actually very interesting, because I've had opportunities to work with and interview people at the American Cancer Society and the American Diabetes Association, and when you look at their websites and you look at their recommendations for diet, it does not. It seems like it doesn't quite line up with what you're talking about and what I've read about and heard about too, and we see these repeated pieces of information that come out that correlate the high consumption of animal products with those diseases. On the other side of the coin, you get the animal, the animal agricultural industry that puts out their own things and tries to give a. It reminds me of the tobacco industry back many years ago when you used to be able to turn on your TV and see Marlboro ads and things like that.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, and that's a great analogy. We're sort of at the same point in history today with animal foods that the tobacco industry was in say 1950, which is to say the medical community hadn't yet decided that tobacco was bad for us. And in fact, there were these ads, as you point out, that had, things like 4 out of 5 doctors promote Camels for their patients who smoke cigarettes, absurd things like that. We're still trying to develop a culture within the medical community that acknowledges and understands that animal foods are actually not good for us. Once that happens, once the standard of care is that a patient with heart disease needs to change his or her diet, I think we'll start to see more change in this country.
Cool. So I want to talk a little bit about the environmental costs and the humane treatment costs, but also we're going to need some, we're going to make sure we have enough time to talk about what you've perceived as an opportunity to right the wrong, okay, to put the ship of state back in the right direction. So we've mentioned a little bit on some of the environmental impact in that, if you're living in a community and you have a factory farm near you, I mean, I live in Northern California, and in driving down to Southern California on Highway 5, you go past Harris Ranch, and boy, you can tell you're getting there 5 miles away if the windows are down. And that's sort of the kind of environmental thing that I think that you're talking about, but it goes beyond that too, doesn't it?
Well, that's certainly one of the components. And when I looked at the environmental costs of animal food production in this country, I added up a lot of the impacts on the environment. Among other things, factory farms have to store animal waste in these huge holding ponds. There's really no other way to deal with it. So waste goes into a pond. The pond, or lagoon, sometimes they're termed. These ponds or lagoons are designed to leach about an inch of their material into the soil every day. That's by design. They're not lined with plastic. They're permeable. So every single day, an inch of animal waste enters our soil. Eventually, it gets into groundwater. Sometimes these ponds break and they get into streams. So we've got animal waste in at least a third of the rivers, lakes, and streams in this country that we can measure. That's just one of the features of the environmental problems associated with animal food production. We've got soil degradation. We've got contribution to climate change because animal food production is very intensive in fossil fuel use. Cows emit a lot of methane, which is more than 20 times as potent a greenhouse gas as CO2, and lots of other problems like that. It's a terrible for the environment. I add those up at about $37 billion per year.
I remember reading something about when you look at the amount of plant farming that's done in the United States and some degree globally, that a very high percentage of the crops that are grown are actually not grown for human consumption, but they're grown for animal consumption. Is that true?
Oh, that's completely true. The majority of the corn and soy grown in this country each year is fed to animals.
And not people.
Well, people eat some of it, but the majority each year is fed to animals.
Wow.
And that raises another interesting issue. We subsidize these industries heavily in this country. So when, for example, one adds up the subsidies to animal agriculture, as I have, one has to include a portion of the subsidies to corn, soy, and other foods used to feed animals.
Wow. We were talking, the thought that came to mind when you were talking about the lagoons or whatever they want to call them, where they store animal waste. I was thinking about the hurricane that hit the Carolinas last year, and there's a lot of hog farming in North Carolina. And I remember reading something about a number of those ponds or whatever that were messed. The levees broke, and it just
Yeah,
can't even comprehend what that must have been like.
That's a massive environmental problem. Typically, when animal waste is released into a river or natural lake or pond, it causes hypoxia. It depletes the entire body of water of oxygen, and all the fish and other marine life will die.
Yeah.
In one spill that I discuss in the book, an estimated 500,000 fish died.
Wow.
And that's just sort of routine.
Amazing. So, you know, and you mentioned fish. That's another interesting thing. Your book talks about that because there's the perspective that, okay, I'm going to stop eating red meat. I'll go to fish because it's better for me. But apparently that's not really the case either. And part of it, I think, had to do with the well, I'll let you describe that because you address that in the book. So the factory fish farming is another challenge that does not necessarily result in positive impact for food either.
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge problem. Today in this country, we get up to half of our fish from fish farms, not wild. And fish who are raised in farms are typically dosed with antibiotics to prevent them from getting disease, to prevent them from getting fish lice and other parasites. That means that we're eating a lot of antibiotics when we eat those fish.
Yeah.
They're typically high in mercury. I had a conversation the other night with a friend who told me he wasn't going to have fish for dinner that night because he's trying to watch his mercury intake. And my thought was, it's great that you're that aware, but if it's on your radar, why eat fish at all? I suppose, since you know it has the mercury.
Right. That was like, why consume a heavy metal if you don't need to?
Exactly.
Well, I think we got about 10 minutes left going on here, so I want to go into something. And there's a lot of other things in your book. I just want to let people know you need to read this book. There's things in here that talk about the impact of even the fishing industry on the depletion of the resources and different things like that, and the usage of land for farming, for raising crops for animals, and what the impact of that has. I mean, it's just an amazing piece of information in the book. But with the last 10 minutes, I want to go to the possible solution. And we're going to go back to the analogy that we had a little earlier, Dave, about the tobacco industry. Because when it was determined that there was a problem with tobacco, federally and on the state level, you go buy a pack of cigarettes and there's like all these taxes that are on it that then are used for different programs to help people stop smoking and a whole bunch of stuff like that. And your book has something similar as a thought when it comes to how we could change the structure with the agricultural animal farming industry.
That's right. So in the case of tobacco and other goods that we consider socially undesirable, alcohol, gasoline, we impose a tax for two reasons. One is we actually are trying to raise the price of that good so that the law of demand will cause consumption to decline. We want consumers to consume less of that good. And that's a legitimate way to adjust consumer behavior, to raise the price. But the second feature is when you tax one of those goods, you actually create a pool of general revenue that can be used for things like education. In the case of tobacco, we've seen that tobacco revenues are used to educate consumers about the health effects of consuming tobacco. And that combination of increased cost and education has been tremendously effective in reducing consumption of tobacco in this country in the last 3 or 4 decades. And we've seen a marked decline in diseases related to tobacco consumption at the same time, like cancer and emphysema, are way down as people consume less, just as you would expect. So that tax is having the exact effect that we had hoped that it would.
So there's a very practical and real example of how this combination of things, education and increasing the cost to the consumer, has had the impact that people are looking for. Because I remember when I was growing up, I mean, smoking was just, like I said, the commercials on TV, and it was the thing to do, and everybody was cool if they were smoking because that's what you were supposed to do when you were growing up. But that's all changed, and they're continuing to do that now that the whole thing about secondhand smoke and all that. So the push is still on there, so that revenue. All right, so let's talk about how that can be used in this environment. What's your thought about that?
So my thought is, why not tax animal foods just as we tax tobacco, gasoline, and alcohol with the same objective, and that is decrease consumption and generate a revenue pool that we can use to spend on more important things. Maybe we subsidize organic vegetables. Maybe we'd educate people about health issues associated with consuming animal foods. In my book, I go through the math involved in a proposed 50% meat tax. So the way that would work is any food product that contains an animal food ingredient, milk, meat, eggs, etc., would have imposed on it a 50% tax. I know that sounds high, but in the case of cigarettes, for example, if you go to New York, you might spend $10 on a $2 pack of cigarettes. So yeah. Look, there's definitely precedent for an extraordinarily high level of tax on a socially undesirable good.
Well, the other thing that it sounds like that this is doing is it's sort of, to some degree, putting what the retail price of the product should be, or closer to what the retail price of the product should be, based on the fact that all of these other externalized costs have been depressing the actual price of the product. And if it were as it should be in the law of supply and demand and the economics of it, then the prices would be up higher like you were talking about earlier.
Yeah, it's definitely heading in that direction. For it to get all the way there, the tax would need to be about 170% rather than 50%. But it's definitely heading in the right direction. A tax like this, if it ever does get imposed in this country or elsewhere, I've estimated would have just tremendous benefits for people, for the environment, for animals. For example, in this country alone, we could probably save the lives of something like 170,000 people every year if we impose this tax and reduce consumption of animal foods.
So one of the things that I think people will say, and that's a challenge, is if you're raising the price of food products like that, how does that what impact does that have on the lower income people?
Well, and that's a great question. Part of my proposal is actually, at the same time as taxing people, we would actually provide people with a tax credit, an annual refund essentially of about $500 per family. That's about the extra amount that people would probably spend on food. They would get that back, and they could use that in however manner they wanted, but one would hope that maybe they would use it to buy fruits, vegetables, healthier foods.
Cool, and that's a component of the program that you're proposing that I think is important, because that's one of the things that I think a lot of people are looking at. Oh, well, if I'm a millionaire, maybe for a little bit more on my meat's no big deal, but the average person or the lower income person, that would be a problem. So this actually mitigates that, because the revenue that's drawn in by virtue of the tax is being redispersed out to the public anyway, and if they're smart about what they're doing, they're not they won't be buying it on a daily basis because it's more expensive than they can handle. But if they're getting a tax refund at the end of the year, they're not going to spread it out for 365 days.
Right. Well, it could even be parceled out on a quarterly basis.
Maybe whatever. It's still, yeah.
But the idea is to put them in the same position as they were before the tax, but just to adjust their consumption toward more healthy foods.
Cool. So Dave, we've got, what, maybe 2 or 3 minutes left before we have to sign off. And so first I want to thank you. I want to remind the people to send in their queries at info@referencepointtv.com. But I want to see if there's anything in the last minute or two that you wanted to convey that we haven't talked about or that you want to re-emphasize.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I'd love to discuss this part of the argument that I make in the book, which is that consumers want to behave rationally. Like that's all we want. We want to get proper price cues and proper information and make buying decisions that are based on logic and reason. The animal food industry in this country prevents us from doing that. They artificially lower prices. They hit us with these incessant messages like beef, it's what's for dinner. And then they pass these laws that make it hard to investigate them, to criticize them, to sue them. And this whole package has diminished the ability of consumers in this country to make informed and independent decisions about what to eat. And that's really what my book's thesis. We just want to understand the facts and make rational decisions. And the industry is making it very, very hard for us to do that.
We want to make our own decisions and not have someone else try to make those decisions for us.
Absolutely.
A great way to end. Thank you, Dave. That's a great finishing statement. So again, thank you for joining us here at Reference Point. Ladies and gentlemen, we appreciate your watching this show. And again, Metanomics by David Robinson Simon. It's a fascinating read and something that I would strongly recommend. So thanks again, everyone, and we'll see you next time on Reference Point.